Introduction. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our retreat. It's always a pleasure to be here meditating with you, and I hope the retreat is helpful for you all. I recommend that you meditate while we talk. The topic of our retreat this year is aging, illness, and death. These themes are central to the Buddhist Dharma, his teaching, which is primarily aimed at answering the question of how not to suffer from aging, illness, and death. This issue, of course, is of central concern for all of us. The Buddha answers this question by offering practical advice on two levels. The first level is how to experience aging, illness, and death without suffering from them. The second level is how to find a dimension where aging, illness, and death are never again experienced. As we'll see, these two answers are closely related. Some people, especially in the West, will be surprised to hear that these issues are central to the Dhamma. After all, questions of aging, illness, and death deal with what is, for most of us, something that will happen in the future, whereas modern versions of Buddhism focus almost exclusive attention on the present moment. In fact, modern Buddhism often focuses on the present moment as a way of avoiding the issues of aging, illness, and death. Don't think about things in the future, we're told. Try to find happiness by appreciating the present moment as an end in itself. The Buddha's approach, though, is to focus on the present moment as a means to a further end, because the present moment is where skills can be developed that will help you to handle the pains and suffering of aging, illness, and death when they inevitably come. This approach is based on the principle of heedfulness. There are things you can do to prepare, so you have to do the work needed to master these skills now, because you don't know when aging, illness, and death will come. Death, for instance, could occur without warning at any time. An important lesson of this retreat will be that these skills are not just a matter of accepting the fact of aging, illness, and death. We need to proactively develop specific skills so that, to repeat, you'll know how to experience aging, illness, and death without suffering from them, and ideally, so that you can know how to find the dimension where aging, illness, and death will never be experienced again. When we look at the story of the young prince who went forth and became the Buddha, we realize that aging, illness, and death were his primary motivation for going forth. He had an audacious desire, not just to resign himself to facts of aging, illness, and death, but to be free from aging, illness, and death altogether. He didn't sit under the Bodhi tree just to rest in the present moment. On the night of his awakening, questions of aging, illness, and death, and particularly death, were foremost in his mind. They were questions for which he was trying to find the answers. We can see this in the three knowledges he gained that led to his awakening. The first knowledge was knowledge of his previous lifetimes. The lesson that he learned from that knowledge was that death is followed by birth. In the second knowledge, he realized that rebirth is directed by your karma, which are your intentional actions, which in turn are shaped by your views and the people whose teachings you respect. He also learned that the connection between karma and rebirth is not simple. The results of the actions you've done during this lifetime can be counteracted by previous actions, by subsequent actions, or, most importantly, by the views and states of mind you have at death. The causal principle that the Buddha learned from seeing this was that present moment karma is necessary to shape how your past moment karma is experienced in the present moment. He also saw that the round of rebirth didn't serve any overarching purpose or lead to any permanent destination. The only prospect for an undying happiness would be to get out of the round entirely. So he applied these lessons to his state of mind, looking at his intentions and views in the present moment to see if there were views that could lead to the way out. The Four Noble Truths were those views. This was the third knowledge he gained on that night. By completing the duties appropriate to each of the Four Noble Truths, he gained knowledge of unbinding, which is the deathless. Now, in finding an escape from death, he confirmed what he had learned about how death happens, and in particular about how cause and effect operate in human action in general, and in the actions that lead to suffering or away from it in particular. The principles of causality underlying the Four Noble Truths are two. We'll be discussing them in detail in the course of the retreat, so here I'll just set them out briefly. The first principle is called this/that conditionality. The second is dependent co-arising. These principles underlie the Buddha's explanations for how aging, illness, and death happen, how they can be approached so as not to suffer from them, and how they can be brought to an end. The basic statement of this/that conditionality is this. 1. When this is, that is. 2. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. 3. When this isn't, that isn't. 4. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. Essentially, what you have here are two causal principles interacting. One is what we call synchronic causality, statements 1 and 3, which describe causes and effects arising and passing away at the same time. When the cause arises, the effect immediately arises. When the cause disappears, the effect immediately disappears. For example, when you stick your finger in the fire, you don't need to wait until the next lifetime before it hurts. It hurts immediately. The second principle is diachronic causality, statements 2 and 4, describing causality over time. The cause happens at one time, and the result can happen later, sometimes much later. But the fact that the first cause eventually ends means that the result will eventually end as well. For example, when you plant a redwood seed, you won't immediately get a full-grown redwood tree. That will have to take time. But just as the action of planting the seed ends, the redwood tree will eventually have to die. Now, the Buddha is basically saying that what we experience in the present moment is the combination of these two principles acting together. This means that some of our experiences of pleasure and pain in the present moment come from causes arising in the present moment itself, and others come from things we did in the past. In fact, our present moment intentions take the raw material coming from past actions and shape it into our actual experience of the present moment. This understanding of causality underlies the focus of Buddhist practice related to aging, illness, and death. You can do things ahead of time to prepare for death that will provide good opportunities when aging, illness, and death come. But you can also develop skills that you will need to use when faced with aging, illness, and death in the present moment. This is why we practice generosity and virtue to provide good opportunities when aging, illness, and death come. This is also why we develop good qualities of mind through meditation, such as mindfulness, alertness, ardency, and discernment, to handle whatever conditions may arise at the time of aging, illness, and death. When we follow these two types of practice together, then at death we're likely to have better things coming in from the past, and also will have the skills to deal with whatever occurs in the mind at that moment. This is one of the reasons why the theme of this retreat is that you can do something about aging, illness, and death. You don't simply have to accept what's happening. You can actually act proactively to shape your experience for the better. That's the first basic principle, this/that conditionality. The second basic principle is dependent co-arising. Several years ago, Bernard asked if I would do a retreat on dependent co-arising, and I told him we would need an entire month. However, there are a couple of basic facts about dependent co-arising that are useful for us to know for the topic of this retreat, and we can cover them briefly. The first fact is that the causes of suffering and of aging, illness, and death come from within the mind. In fact, almost half the factors in dependent co-arising come prior to sensory contact. In other words, even before you see or hear or touch something, factors in your mind have already primed you to suffer from that contact or not. The second fact that's important to know is that the immediate cause of suffering is craving. From craving comes clinging, which is the actual suffering. From clinging you go to becoming, which means taking on an identity in a world of experience. Now, the process of becoming is what makes it possible to take birth. This happens both inside the mind and in the outside world. For example, right now, suppose that, as you're sitting here, the thought comes into your mind that you'd like some ice cream. Then you think of the world related to your desire for ice cream, the things that either would help you with that desire or would get in the way. The things that would help you are the fact that you have a car parked out in the parking lot and you have money in your pocket. Things that get in the way include the two monks talking to you right now, and it would be impolite to leave the room while they're talking. That's the world of a becoming that could happen in your mind right now. As for your identity in that world, if you decide that, yes, you want some ice cream, you play the role of the person who is capable of getting the ice cream and the role of the person who will enjoy the ice cream. On top of that, there's also the you who is commenting on whether you in these two roles is acting rightly or not. This is you as the commentator. Now, on the larger level, if you're dying and you want to continue existing, a mental image will come to your mind showing you another world in which you could be reborn. If you go into that world, you die from this lifetime and you would be reborn as a being in another lifetime. Images of this sort could be telling you the truth, or they could be false, but even when they're true, that doesn't guarantee that the world they lead you to would be as good as it seems in the image. For instance, suppose that it's showing you a beautiful world, but it doesn't tell you that when you enter into this world, there will be more aging, illness, and death again. Yet even if it does tell you that, it's often the case that when you die from this body, you're desperate, thinking, I'll take what I can get. That's a tendency over which you want to get some control. This is an important reason for why, when we meditate, we observe the mind in the present moment and try to gain some control over it, because you're seeing the processes of becoming happening again and again right here and now in your mind. In particular, you want to gain some control over the cravings that would otherwise lead you to take on bad states of becoming. Now, the craving that causes suffering is not just a desire for things to be different from what they are. Actually, there are three specific types of craving that lead to clinging and suffering: craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, and craving for non-becoming. We'll discuss these later in the retreat. As we'll also see, to escape from becoming requires that we understand the steps leading up to craving and becoming, and then to develop dispassion for those steps. There was one time when Sariputta was teaching a group of monks who were going to a foreign country. He said to them, "The people there are intelligent. Suppose they ask you, 'What does your teacher teach?' What will you tell them?" The monks said that they would like to hear Sariputta's answer, and what he said was this: "Our teacher teaches the ending of desire and passion." That's an interesting way of boiling the Buddhist teachings down to their basic message. A lot of people don't like to hear this message. Dispassion, the ending of passion, strikes us as a dead, dull mind state. The best way to understand dispassion, however, is to see that when you feel dispassion for something, you've basically outgrown it. It's like outgrowing tic-tac-toe or chess. When you're a certain age, tic-tac-toe is fascinating, but then there comes a time where you've figured out all the possible moves, so it no longer holds any interest for you. As for chess, you may never figure out all the possible games, but you see that the rules are so artificial that whatever skill you develop in the game won't be worth the time invested. In either case, you develop dispassion for the game. You've outgrown it. This is why we meditate. We're basically outgrowing our infatuation with the steps that lead to craving and developing dispassion for them. When we develop dispassion for them, craving goes away without our having to attack it directly. Independent co-arising, there are a lot of steps before craving, prior even to sensory contact, such as ignorance, fabrication, and name and form. These are the mental events that can prime you to suffer even before sights, sounds, etc. have made contact at the senses. We won't be going through all of these different factors on this retreat. We'll focus on two. The first is ignorance of the Four Noble Truths and the skills related to them. The second factor we'll be concentrating on will be fabrications, or sankhara, the mental processes that are the sources of our bodily, verbal, and mental actions. The solution to the problem of suffering is to bring knowledge, based on the Four Noble Truths, to the processes of fabrication. When you do that, you develop dispassion for them, and then the causal links that will lead up to craving and suffering will fall away. Now, it turns out that when the Buddha taught breath meditation, he taught it in such a way as to focus appropriate attention on just those factors of fabrication, seeing them in the light of the Four Noble Truths. So an important part of the retreat will be to get some practice in breath meditation in line with the way the Buddha taught it. The organization of the retreat is this. In the evening, we'll have talks on aging, illness, and death in the light of the insights the Buddha gained on the night of his awakening. The morning talks will be related to issues of breath meditation. In the afternoon, we'll have time to answer questions related to both issues. We'll place a bowl up here in which you can put your questions. One question that often comes up when we're doing breath meditation like this is, are we using our imagination too much by imagining these breath energies? Actually, the breath energies are already there. but it's only when you allow yourself to imagine them that you can perceive them. It's like imagining that the world is round. When you first heard that as a child, you didn't have any evidence. You had to imagine that it was round. But as you get older, you gain experience to prove that it's true. For instance, when flying from Los Angeles to Paris, the fastest route is over northern Canada. If the world were flat, you wouldn't save time by flying that route. Mindfulness of breathing. Body. This morning, I'd like to begin talking about how we can use the Buddhist teachings on breath meditation to help prepare ourselves for aging, illness, and death. Given how mindfulness of breathing can have a positive impact on your health, it's obvious that breath meditation can be helpful as you age and grow ill. But given that the breath stops at death, it may seem odd that the breath could help prepare you for the process of dying. But it's important to note that many of the factors that will be playing a role in the mind as you approach death are the same factors that are listed in dependent co-arising prior to sensory input. Two in particular stand out: fabrication, intention, and attention, under the factor of name and form. For a meditation method to give rise to discernment and insight, it has to direct attention to precisely these factors. Otherwise, they stay in the dark, underground. And you don't want any important forces in the mind to be in the dark as you're about to die. You want to be on familiar terms with them. Now, when we look at the Buddha's instructions on breath meditation, we find that the steps he lays out do precisely that. They focus attention on the processes of fabrication, intention, and attention so that you can know them well in real time. There are 16 steps in all, divided into 4 sets of 4, called tetrads. Each tetrad deals with one of the frames of reference for the establishing of mindfulness: body, feelings, mind, and mental qualities. These frames of reference, in turn, are the themes for getting the mind into concentration. The Buddha put 4 steps into each tetrad, apparently for ease of memorization, because when we see how he elaborates on these steps in other parts of the canon, some of the tetrads contain a number of implied steps. So to understand them, it's good to know what those implied steps are. This morning we won't have time to cover all 4 tetrads, so I'll focus the discussion on the first one, dealing with the body. We can save the other tetrads for the mornings to come. The main thing I want you to notice this morning is that even though the first tetrad focuses on the body, it does so in a way that underlines the role that the mental event plays in shaping your experience of the body. This is in line with the first verse of the Dhammapada. Phenomena are preceded by the heart and mind. The first tetrad focuses on how this principle applies to your experience of the breath. Part of this focus lies in the way the Buddha uses the word fabrication in the 4th step of this tetrad. The basic dynamic, which he follows in other tetrads as well, is that he first tries to sensitize you to the fact that you fabricate this aspect of your awareness through your intentions. Then he has you use that sensitivity first to energize yourself, and then to calm yourself. In this way, he's having you develop tranquility and insight together. As he says elsewhere, insight is developed by understanding fabrications. Tranquility comes from calming the mind down and allowing it to enjoy the resulting stillness. So when you use the processes of fabrication to calm the mind down, you're gaining both insight and tranquility together. The emphasis on fabrication means that you're not just learning about the breath here, you're also learning about the mind. This is why breath meditation is such a good preparation for death. Given that we're using the breath to become more sensitive to the mind's activity of fabrication, the breath is actually leading us to the mind in a way that helps us master the processes of fabrication, knowledge that will be especially useful both in daily life and as we encounter death. One more point before looking at the first tetrad. It's not the case that the 4 tetrads are to be followed in numerical order. Actually, each tetrad deals with an aspect of experience that's constantly present throughout the meditation. When you're with the breath, feelings are right there, your mind state is right there, mental qualities are right there. This means that the 4 tetrads have to be practiced together. As you focus on the breath to get the mind to calm down but encounter problems, sometimes the problem is breath, sometimes feelings, sometimes the state of mind and the mental qualities you're bringing to the breath. So your focus will have to shift among these tetrads to deal with the problem at hand. In all cases, though, you stay anchored in the breath to ensure that you're staying with what's actually going on in the present moment. The 4 steps in the first tetrad are discerning when the breath is long, discerning when the breath is short, training yourself to breathe in and out sensitive to the whole body, and then training yourself to breathe in and out calming, what the Buddha calls bodily fabrication, which is a technical term for the in and out breath. All these steps fall under the body in and of itself as a frame of reference. Let's look at these steps in detail. The first 2 steps consist of simply discerning distinctions between breaths. How do you experience the difference between long breathing and short breathing? Which feels better? Ajahn Lee would add a few more variables here. He would note that there are a lot of other ways you can adjust the breath too. In long, out short. In short, out long. You can do heavy breathing, light breathing, fast, slow, shallow, deep. The purpose of discerning distinctions in the breathing is to see what really feels good right now, because ultimately, as we'll see tomorrow in the section on feeling, you try to arrive at a state where you're sensitive to rapture, sensitive to pleasure. These states of rapture and pleasure don't just happen on their own. These feelings are called pleasure not of the flesh, the pleasure associated with strong concentration, and that pleasure doesn't happen without your intending it to happen. How is that going to happen? Through the way you intend to breathe. So you want to get sensitive to variations in the breath. What kind of breathing feels good right now, and what way of breathing would induce, say, a state of rapture? That requires the next step, which is to train yourself to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in, the whole body as you breathe out. Ajahn Lee notes that as you become sensitive to the whole body, you will sense subtle energies flowing through the body in sync with the breath. This perception is useful because in other suttas where the Buddha is talking about concentration, he says that you then want to take whatever sense of feeling of pleasure or rapture you've developed and let it permeate the entire body, suffuse the entire body. Having a sense of the breath flowing throughout the body makes it easier for those feelings to flow without interruption as well. Now, there's an implied step that follows here, which is that when you become aware of the whole body, you try to energize the body as you breathe in and breathe out. That's because the next step is to calm bodily fabrication. As the Buddha says elsewhere, in his explanation of the factors for awakening, if you try to calm things down before they're energized, you go to sleep, which is not what you want, so you've got to energize things first. This is why Ajahn Lee, when he gives breath meditation instructions, says to start out with long breathing, deep breathing, and then let the breath adjust to what seems to be just right. Otherwise, you're going to put yourself to sleep. The important point here is that you don't just stay with whatever way the body is breathing on its own. You're going to take advantage of the fact that you can adjust the breath to create feelings of rapture and pleasure. In the 4th step of this tetrad, you train yourself to calm bodily fabrication. This doesn't mean that you try to suppress the breath. It's simply that as the mind grows calmer, the breath naturally grows more gentle on its own. This is where you can see how the state of the mind has an influence on the breath. You can actually reach the point where the in and out breathing stops. Again, not because you're holding it or suppressing it, but simply that you feel no need to breathe. The breath energy in the body is sufficient. In fact, there's one sutta where the Buddha says that's precisely where bodily fabrication has been calmed, when you're in the 4th jhana, where the sense of the in and out breathing has stopped. The oxygen used in the body is very low at that point. I've heard different explanations as to whether there's oxygen exchange going on through the skin. Some people say yes, other people say no. What's important for you as a meditator, though, is that the sense that the energy in the body is sufficient. You don't feel the need to breathe because you feel breath energy already saturating the body. All the breath channels are so well connected that if there's a lack of breath energy in one part, the excess energy in another part will flow right there, so everything is kept in balance. The question sometimes is asked, why does the Buddha use a technical term, bodily fabrication, when he's simply talking about the in and out breath? The answer, as I've already indicated, is that he's pointing to the role that your intentions play in shaping the way you breathe. The breath is a rare bodily function that can be both automatic and intentionally shaped. The Buddha is emphasizing this so as to turn your attention inside, toward the mind, and the mental processes that will play a role in calming the breath, choosing what to pay attention to, which intentions to follow, which intentions to drop. That's the first tetrad. We'll look in more detail at feelings tomorrow. We'll now begin our period of walking meditation. We suggest that you try to find a path that's no less than 30 steps long. There are two ways you can do meditation while you walk. One is to focus on the breath. In other words, you try to take the same meditation topic you've been focusing on as you sit, and then carry it into the next step, which is to stay focused there even while you move the body. In America, we would say that you learn how to meditate while you walk and chew gum at the same time. The other way is to focus on the movement of your feet. You can think of a meditation word as your feet go left, right, left, right. You can use the words left, right, or bud-do, bud-do. Try to walk at a normal pace, because the purpose of walking meditation is to learn how to carry your concentration into the movement and activities of daily life. If you have a path where you're walking back and forth, when you reach the end of the path, stop for a moment, make sure that your mindfulness is established, then turn and head in the other direction. Make up your mind ahead of time that you will always turn in the same direction, clockwise or counterclockwise. Do your best to maintain your mindfulness all the way to the other end of the path. The image they give in the canon is of a man with a bowl on top of his head, filled to the brim with oil. On one side of him, there's a beauty queen singing and dancing. On the other side, there's a crowd of people excited about the beauty queen singing and dancing. He has to walk between the two. Behind him is a man with a raised sword. If he drops one drop of oil, the man with the sword will cut off his head. We'll meet back here at 10:45. I hope you all will still have your heads on. Question and answers. Question. I can either breathe automatically without being aware of my breath, or when I observe my breath, I feel I am controlling it. Only once I had the experience of observing my breath without controlling it. It was a deep spiritual experience, but it only lasted 10 seconds. How am I supposed to interpret this experience? Why isn't it happening again? What can I do to have this experience every time that I meditate? Answer. I'd like to have that every time I meditate. We are always controlling the breath to some extent or another, except when the mind is in very deep concentration. The way to duplicate the experience of sensing the breath without controlling it is first to learn how to control it skillfully, in other words, to maintain the breath at a comfortable rhythm, with the sense of ease spreading throughout the body. There will come a point where the breath is comfortable enough that the mind puts aside its desire to control, and you can simply be one with the breath. An image I use is that it's like focusing a camera lens. Normally the point of focus is outside of the lens. This is how we normally relate to the breath. The mind is at one point, the breath at another point. Now, if you can imagine the focal point being inside the lens, that's the stage where the breath is not under your control. In other words, you can be aware of the breath without controlling it. Now, in terms of the Buddhist map of mental states that you can get into when you meditate, this would be the same as the second jhana. The way to get to the second jhana first is to get really good at the first jhana. Have your mind centered on one spot and then fill your body with your awareness. Then allow the breath to be as comfortable as possible, and when it's comfortable, allow that sense of comfort to spread through the body too, dissolving away any patterns of tension you may feel in the body. Question. What to do to cure negative emotions that come from an avid desire that can't be realized? Is it necessary to separate oneself from the source of the desire, or should one confront it to observe what will happen? Answer. First, what do you understand to be the source of the desire? Remember, the source of the desire is not, say, the person outside or the thing outside. The source of the desire is actually inside your own mind. Ajahn Fuang once made the comment that the things that we desire most in life, especially in terms of the pleasures of the senses, are things we used to have in a previous lifetime. Then he said to think about that for a few minutes. Even if you get what you desire again, you're going to lose it again and miss it again. So the question is, how many times do you want to keep on losing it? In other words, the desire comes from a sense of lack. When you realize that you've had this object many times before, but then you've lost it again, tell yourself you don't really lack that thing. You've had it enough already. You can be perfectly happy without it. When you've decided that you've had enough, that will end the desire and the suffering that goes along with it. Question. Yesterday you said that at the moment of death, images of intense pleasure could arise. That is a possibility, yes? There might be a temptation to go to a marvelous world that awaits us, but there might also be the choice not to come back, to cut this chain of lives. Is this what you actually said? At every moment of death, would we have this choice with a mind that is acutely desiring to cut the chain of samsara? Answer: many things can possibly arise at the time of death. There can be some visions of intense pleasure, but also some visions of possible pain and suffering. We will have the choice at that moment. If we have our wits about us, we'll be able to choose where we want to go. The problem, though, is that you may see a world of suffering awaiting you, and you think back on the bad things you've done in the past. You think that you deserve to suffer, and you'll actually feel compelled to go to that world of suffering. This is what happens to most people when they die. Different visions will appear to them, based on their past karma, and they will go to one or feel compelled to go to another because of their memories. We'll get into this topic in a couple of days. You would think that people would automatically go to the places that look happy, but sometimes you can see a strange tendency even as you're meditating, when a sense of pleasure comes to you and you feel that you don't deserve it or that you're not good enough for it. This is one of the reasons why, when we meditate, we try to think of healthy narratives of our ability to become happy. We're practicing how to formulate new narratives so that we can have a healthy attitude toward pleasure, remembering the good things we've done. This is one of the reasons why, in Buddhist countries, when someone is dying, people around them will try to remind them of the good things they have done in terms of their virtue and generosity. Now, simply willing the process of rebirth to end is not enough to make it end. You have to understand the process of becoming, as we described it last night, and learn how to abort that process. What usually happens at death is that the mind wants to find a new location in space and time. This is a very old habit that we've been through many times before, trying to find a new location, thinking, I can't stay here, I have to go someplace else. To get out of samsara, we have to learn how to break that habit, learning how not to feel compelled to stay someplace or to go someplace. One of the reasons why, when we meditate, we try to get out of the worlds of our distractions is so that we can begin to break that habit. After all, if you can be distracted while you're sitting and meditating in this beautiful place, what's it going to be like when you're dying in a hospital and there are lights and beeping sounds all around you and people crying? So, the first step in getting out of samsara is learning how to get past your distractions. We'll talk about this in more detail in a few days. Question: some people have skills to hear, see, or communicate with other beings, humans who have passed away, with souls, but not in a Catholic context. Those souls have a center and a mind to gather a soul body and energy body and centered together. Also, human beings in transition, dying, will be reborn in the next life as human beings with the karmic potential in this center and mind as a continuity of the process of the mind. How to explain this apparent split or bifurcation of this center or mind? Answer: there is no split or bifurcation. There are lots of alternatives that face us after death. Some human beings, when they die, go to a higher level where they can just stay there with an energy body, as a Deva or Brahma. Some of those beings on the higher levels then become deluded, thinking that they have found their permanent place, but they haven't. They will eventually fall from that state and take rebirth on a lower level. Other human beings come back as human beings, or on a lower level. It depends on your past karma and on your state of mind at death, but none of these states of being are permanent. The higher beings can fall, the lower animals can come back up. So our task is to try to come back to a good level where we can practice so that ultimately we get out of this mess entirely, and it is a mess. Ajahn Mun said that he could remember having been reborn as a dog 500 times, simply because it appealed to him at the time. One thing you have to watch out for at the moment of death is the worlds that appear attractive but have bad potentials. I don't know if any of you saw the movie Ice Age 2. I happened to see it on a plane ride one time. A child sitting in the seat in front of me had the whole Ice Age series, which he watched going over the Pacific. In the second film, there's a scene where the main characters, female and male animals, are drifting in a boat in a fog, and suddenly they see beautiful mermaids and mermen appearing brightly in the fog, and all of the animals are really attracted to them. But as you get closer to them, you begin to realize that in the images of the mermaids and mermen, there's a lot of static. If you look into the static, you see piranha fish with teeth and fangs. So watch out, look carefully. Another good reason not to come back. Question: is there something we can do to try to create the conditions for a good rebirth when it comes to our animals and pets? I'm thinking of the last days and moments of death itself. My sister's cat is dying and visibly suffering. How to help it grow on the path? Answer: basically, what you want to do is help calm the animal's mind and also try to eliminate as much of its pain as you can. Show that you love it, and that will be very encouraging for it. Now, for an animal that's not yet dying, you try to do your best to keep it from killing other animals. Again, Ajahn Mun, he had a cat, and, as he told the other monks at the monastery, the cat used to be a tiger. So he told them do their best not to get the cat angry, so as to raise the level of its mind. When animals are around humans, it's good for them. It helps them to develop more human characteristics. The process of rebirth. Yesterday we said we would be approaching questions of aging, illness, and death from the perspective of what the Buddha learned about these topics during his awakening. This raises the question, how can anyone, even the Buddha, know what happens at death before they die? There are two answers. The first is that the Buddha found a deathless dimension on the night of his awakening, and that fact shows that he came to a correct understanding of death in the course of his 3 knowledges. The second answer is that he saw that he had died many times, and he was able to understand the process of what happens when you die. It's an important point that he saw the process as a process that comes from the mind and that can be stopped by training the mind. He never got involved in the question of what dies or what gets reborn. He focused totally on the events of death and rebirth in and of themselves as actions that constitute steps in a process, one that we can control and can bring to an end. You're not responsible for what you are, but you are responsible for what you do, and what you do can make a difference, even as you're dying. This brings up another question. How can a human being, as a conditioned being, experience something that is deathless and unconditioned? The response is that the question has the context backwards. It starts with a definition of what we are and then, arguing from that definition, places limits on what we can know. The Buddha saw that by defining yourself, you place limits on yourself, so he put aside the question of what he was and experimented to see what he could do with the mind and know as a result. And he found that it was possible to act in such a way as to cut the process leading to rebirth and to reach the deathless. The realization of Nibbana comes with the knowledge that the mind is released from aging, illness, and death. There's no more birth, and that realization is what gives you total freedom from limitations. One of the reasons why the Buddha taught not self is so that you don't place limitations on your ability to find the deathless too. The Buddha knew that he couldn't prove his understanding of death and rebirth to you. You have to practice the path he taught so that you can learn about death and rebirth on your own, but he did recommend adopting his teachings on these topics as a working hypothesis, and he offers 2 pragmatic proofs for doing so. The first is that you will tend to behave more skillfully and harmlessly if you adopt, as a working hypothesis, his teachings on the connection between karma and rebirth. If you believe that your actions have an impact on whether you experience pleasure or pain, you'll be more heedful and careful in what you do. If you don't believe that your actions can have that impact, you'll tend to be less skillful in what you do. The second pragmatic proof is that by accepting these hypotheses, you leave open possibilities that you would close off if you didn't accept them. If you don't believe in the deathless, you won't make the effort to see if it could possibly be a reality. If you are open to the possibility that there could be a deathless dimension, you'll be more inclined to do what is necessary to prove whether or not it's true. Now, because you don't yet know for yourself, why close off good things that could be possible? As we'll see, the Buddha recommends developing strengths in the mind to compensate for the weakness of the body as you age, grow ill, and die, and conviction in his awakening is one of those strengths. This is a point we'll explore further tomorrow. Tonight, we're going to talk about the process of rebirth. The Buddha calls this further becoming, punnabhava. As we've already said, becoming means taking on an identity in a world of experience. This happens on many levels, both micro and macro, both inside the mind and in the world outside. Examples on the micro level start with a desire and then you cling to it, purely as a mental act. Now, clinging can take four forms: clinging to sensuality, clinging to views, clinging to habits and practices, and clinging to doctrines of self. These four types of clinging correspond to four mental functions that are recognized by modern psychology. The first, clinging to sensuality, corresponds to raw desire, which Freud would call id. Clinging to views corresponds to what's called the reality principle, what you feel is real in the world and how reality works in terms of causes and effects that you can and cannot control. Clinging to habits and practices corresponds to what you think should be done given your view of reality. This is what Freud would call your superego. Clinging to doctrines of self basically is your sense of who you are and whether you will benefit from following your desires or not. This corresponds to what Freud calls the ego, which negotiates among the other clingings. Now, even though Buddhism and modern psychology both recognize these mental functions, the Buddhist interpretation of them differs from modern psychology on 2 points. The first is that, from the Buddhist perspective, no desire is raw. Each desire has its reasons. In fact, the Buddha defines sensuality as your thoughts and plans for sensual pleasures. In other words, the problem is not the pleasures themselves. The problem is your fascination with thinking about them. For example, a pizza in itself is not a problem. If you're sitting here thinking about how you want to eat a pizza after the talk tonight and how you plan to slip out to Musch's, that would be a problem because you're not going to be hearing what I'm saying. You're going to be absorbed in your thoughts about a pizza. That's the first point of difference. The second point of difference is that modern psychology sees a constant conflict among your clingings, a conflict that is never resolved. The Buddha's view, on the other hand, is that it is possible to develop skillful forms of clinging that are not always in conflict. They can actually help you hold on to the path that leads to awakening. We can think of the path as being like a raft that you take across a river. While you're on the river, you need to hold on to the raft. When you get to the other side, then you can let the raft go. I'll give you some examples of how clinging then leads to becoming. For a micro-level example, i.e., the small level in the mind, we can talk about that evening snack in Musch's. People tell me that I talk too much about pizza, so we'll talk about ice cream instead. During this evening's meditation session and during the talk, suppose that you're fantasizing about ice cream. Now, the world in that desire or fantasy would be the things in the world outside that would help you get ice cream, such as the ice cream parlors in Musch's, and the things that would get in the way. There are other aspects to the actual world outside that would be irrelevant to your desire for ice cream, so they don't play a role in that particular becoming. Another part of becoming is your role in that world. In other words, the things you'd be willing to do to get the ice cream. It's like a theater piece with 3 characters. There's the self as the producer, in other words, the self that has the ability to get out of here, go to Musch's, and buy the ice cream. There's the consumer, the self that anticipates the joy in consuming the ice cream. And then there's the commentator that decides, is this really worth going for or not? Now, sometimes there's a conflict among these 3 roles, and there can also be a conflict among different becomings because of a conflict among the desires on which they're based. These conflicts can add extra suffering and stress on top of the suffering that's inherent in each becoming. The inherent suffering comes from the fact that the desire underlying your becoming gets frustrated for one of 3 reasons. Either you can't get what you want, or you get what you want but it's not as good as you thought it would be, or it is good, but then it leaves you. The same principles apply to becoming on what's called the macro level in the world outside. For instance, imagine that you're dying and you can't stay in the body. Options of where you could go will start appearing to you. You focus on craving one of them, you cling to that craving, and then you enter into that world and take on an identity in that world around what you crave. The Buddha's image is of a fire going from one house to another. In his days, they believed that fire, in order to burn, had to cling to something. In this case, the fire clings to the wind that takes it to the next house. So you're riding the wind as you go to the next life. This may sound good, you get to go where you want to go, but it's actually very risky. Think of all of the different dangers facing you at the moment of death. First, you're desperate. You can't stay here and you're being pushed out, so you'll go anywhere. Sometimes, because of your past karma, you see no good options available, so you're forced to take whatever is available. Second, your craving can be very diluted. Think about that example from Ice Age 2 that I talked about earlier this afternoon. The mermaids and mermen look attractive, but they'll eat you up. Third, the mind and its cravings can change direction so quickly that the Buddha said there's no image to illustrate how fast that change can be. Even the image of the wind blowing a wildfire is too slow. So if you suddenly happen to be overcome by lust or anger, or any of the other mental hindrances at that point, that mind state will take you to a bad destination. And it could happen at the moment of death that you're not very lucid or alert. You've had an experience like this many times. As you're falling asleep, your mind can just grasp onto anything at all, with no sense of right or wrong, good or bad. It just goes. So there's a need to train the mind so that you can recognize craving and learn how not to fall for it. As we said last night, the Buddha taught that there are 3 kinds of craving that lead to becoming. You may have heard that craving means to want things to be different from what they are, but that's not the Buddha's definition. After all, wanting to become awakened is actually part of the path. At the moment of death, you have to watch out specifically for the 3 types of craving that lead to becoming. The first is craving for sensuality. As I said earlier, this is focused not so much on sensual pleasures as it is on the mind's fascination with fantasizing and planning for sensual pleasures. Now, becoming, your sense of your identity in your imaginary world, often plays a big role in these fantasies. You might like to play the role of the seducer, or the seduced. There's an example of this in the Therigatha, the verses of the elder nuns. The story is that a nun is going alone through a forest, and a libertine comes up to her and tries to persuade her to leave the nunhood and become his wife. Instead of talking about having sex, though, he talks to her about what she will become if she goes with him. He basically says she will become a golden doll, surrounded by a beautiful house, loving servants, and all kinds of beautiful things. In other words, he's creating a world in which she can imagine herself taking on a new identity. You've probably seen this in your own sensual fantasies. They tend to be about who you are and the role you play in a particular world. Just as an aside, I'll tell you how the story ends. It turns out that the nun is a non-returner, which means she has no interest in sensuality. So she asks the libertine, "What do you imagine to be attractive in this ugly body?" And he says, "Your eyes." So she says, "But these eyes, they're full of eye secretions, and they're just ugly little balls stuck into the face." And he says, "But they're really beautiful. I really crave your eyes." So she plucks out one eye and hands it to him. "Here then, take it." All of a sudden, it's not beautiful anymore, and her fierce determination scares him, so he apologizes and leaves her alone. She then goes to see the Buddha, and as soon as she sees him, she gets her eye back. The second form of craving is craving for becoming, the desire simply to have an identity in a world someplace. Then finally there's craving for non-becoming, which is wanting to see your current becoming demolished. In other words, you don't like who you are, you don't like the world in which you live, so you'd like to see the whole thing destroyed. Now, it may seem counterintuitive that craving for non-becoming would actually lead to more becoming, but if you keep thinking in terms of a self and a world to destroy, and of how much you'll enjoy the oblivion that comes when they're destroyed, you're thinking in the terms of becoming, a self and a world, and that creates the conditions for a new state of becoming. In fact, the Buddha said that seeing how there is becoming in the act of craving for non-becoming was one of his special insights on the night of his awakening. Now, these 3 kinds of craving can come on very strong at death. For example, if you're suffering a lot of pain at death, the mind will immediately go to sensuality. As the Buddha said, for most people their only escape from pain is to start thinking sensual thoughts. Or if you fear annihilation at the moment of death, then you'll go for any possible becoming that might appear to you. Or the hatred of suffering and the exhaustion that comes from the pains you feel as you're dying could lead you to want to be obliterated, which would be craving for non-becoming. Now, this presents a strategic challenge. If craving for non-becoming leads to more becoming, what can you do to get out of further becoming? The Buddha's answer to that is you turn your focus away from becoming and focus instead on the processes that lead up to craving before they coalesce into becoming. If you can develop dispassion for those steps, that will abort the process. As for whatever state of becoming you already have, that will end on its own. This is why dispassion was a central theme of the Buddhist teachings. You see that the effort to continue fabricating becoming out of raw material that's inconstant and undependable isn't worth it. It's like seeing that you're building a house out of frozen meat, and you realize that the house is going to melt and create a huge mess when summer comes, so you feel no desire to continue building such a thing. The Buddha says that there are 5 steps that lead to dispassion. First, you see the origination of the steps in the process leading to craving, in other words, what causes them. And when the Buddha uses the word origination, samudaya, he's usually referring to causes that arise in the mind. Second, you see how those steps in the process pass away. Third, you see their allure, why you're attracted to them. But then fourth, you also see the drawbacks of clinging to them. The 5th step is when you see that the allure is outweighed by the drawbacks. That's when you develop dispassion, which is the escape. We'll discuss these steps in more detail later on in the retreat. You can begin to see how meditation is ideal preparation for dying. You get to see events in the mind as processes in these terms before they turn into a becoming. Ideally, you should want to put an end to the process so that there's no wind going to the next house, and no more fire to ride the wind, i.e., the act of identifying with the being that clings to the craving. However, most people don't develop that much skill. So the second best skill is making sure that the house next door is a good house to go to, and this is done by creating good karma. This is why the Buddha advises practicing virtue, generosity, goodwill, and the other perfections, as we taught at the last retreat, until they become habitual parts of your character. In this way, even though there is a wind, it'll be likely to take you to a good house. This is why the Buddha's instructions on how to prepare for death include qualities you develop in daily life right here and now. As I mentioned last night, the teaching on good karma is not a simple teaching. For a good rebirth, not only do you have to do good deeds, but you also have to continue doing good deeds throughout life and to maintain right view all the way through the moment of death. He saw that there were cases where people did good deeds, but then they had a bad change of heart at the moment of death, which pulled them down. On the other hand, though, he saw that there were people who had done bad deeds during this life, but had a good change of heart at the moment of death, and so they went up in the next life. Now, the results of their earlier bad actions were not destroyed, they were simply delayed. Cases of this second type are heartening. If you know that you've done bad deeds in the past, you're not doomed to a bad destination. But cases of the first type warn you that you need to be heedful. You can't just accept things as they happen and be nothing more than a passive witness to the passing show. You play a role in shaping events, so you want to do your best to shape things in a good direction. So, stay confident that when death comes, you'll be able to do something about it. In other words, you can do something good about what's going to happen next after death. As for aging and illness, in dealing with them skillfully, you learn skills that will be needed at death. As you learn how to deal skillfully with aging, you learn how not to be overcome by physical weakness. As you learn how to deal skillfully with illness, you learn how not to be confined by pain. Both of these developments, physical weakness and pain, tend to diminish the range of the becoming that you're experiencing right now. It's as if the world is beginning to close in on you, so there are fewer and fewer options as to what you can do. So you need to learn how to keep your mind from being restricted by pains and physical weakness as you age and grow ill. These will be the topics we'll talk about for the next 2 nights. I'll end with a story. In Thailand, funerals often last for months, which means that before the cremation, they have time to print a book and hand it out at the cremation in honor of the person who passed away. The book can be about anything: the Dharma, how to run a kitchen in the old-fashioned way, how the kings of the past used to punish their children, all kinds of things. There will usually be a little biography at the beginning of the book. It'll talk about how the deceased person was born, their education, how they got married, how they had children, how they succeeded in life, and then how they began to have a little illness here or there, and then the illnesses got stronger and stronger, and the doctors always did their best to help the patient, but then they reached the point where even the best doctors couldn't help. For me, that was always the most important part of the biography, the point where nobody can help you. What do? This is what meditation is for, to give you skills to use at that point, so that even when no one else can help you, you can help yourself. Mindfulness of breathing. Feelings. This morning, I'd like to continue with some instructions based on the Buddha's instructions on breath meditation, this time focusing on the second tetrad, which deals with feelings as its frame of reference. As I noted yesterday morning, it's not the case that the 4 tetrads are to be followed in numerical order. Actually, each tetrad deals with an aspect of experience that's constantly present throughout the meditation. So even though we'll be talking about feelings today, remember that you want to stay grounded in the breath as you observe how feelings play a role in developing both tranquility and insight as you meditate. The steps in this second tetrad are these. You train yourself to breathe in and out sensitive to rapture, to breathe in and out sensitive to pleasure, to breathe in and out sensitive to mental fabrication, which are your feelings and perceptions, and then to breathe in and out calming mental fabrication. With regard to the first step, of inducing rapture, note that the word for rapture here, piti, can also mean refreshment. In some instances and for some people, these sensations will be strong and clearly rapturous, even ecstatic. For others, they will be gentler and simply refreshing. This is not a measure of the power of your concentration. It's simply an indicator of how much energy your body has been lacking and how it responds when the energy becomes more full. The Buddha says elsewhere that the kind of rapture you're trying to induce here is both physical and mental. You induce physical rapture or fullness by the way you breathe. You induce mental rapture by the perceptions you cultivate. For instance, if you breathe out in a way where you're squeezing the energy out of the body, that's not going to help with the physical sense of rapture. You have to breathe out in a way that doesn't squeeze things. You can tell yourself, I'll put energy into breathing in, let the body breathe out on its own, I don't have to squeeze the breath out. You also have to be careful not to squeeze anything at the end of the in-breath or the end of the out-breath. This too is a common mistake when people are doing breath meditation. They want to have a clear dividing line so that they can know, this is the in-breath, this is the out-breath. So they make a little squeeze between the two in the energy field of the body. Learn how to resist that temptation. You don't need that clear dividing line. Think of the in-breath flowing into the out-breath, and the out-breath flowing into the in-breath. Breath, breathing breath. Don't squeeze to make a distinction between the two. You'll find that if you don't squeeze the energy out as you breathe out, and you don't make a little squeeze as you're switching from one breath to the next, a sense of fullness begins to develop in the body. That, Ajahn Lee would identify with rapture. It's a sense of refreshment, a sense of energy flowing around. Then you can do the same thing with pleasure, sukha, which can also be translated as ease. Wherever there are feelings of ease or pleasure in the body, breathe in a way that protects them. Don't squeeze them, don't destroy them. Once you've got these feelings established, then allow them to spread through the body, following your sense of the breath permeating the whole body. As you do this, you're using your intentions to shape the breath and the feeling, and then the feelings will turn around and have an effect on the mind. The perceptions of breath energy flowing, the pleasure flowing, will also have an impact on the mind, making it more focused, happier to be here in the present moment. You're seeing feelings and perceptions as mental fabrications in action. That's the third step in this tetrad. Then, for the fourth, you want to see which perceptions, which feelings will calm the mind down. There might come a point after a while when you decide that the rapture is just too much. This is where you have to learn how to change your perceptions. Ajahn Lee and Ajahn Fuang would talk about having the energy flow out the arms, out the palms of your hands, flow down your legs, out the soles of the feet. I've also found it useful to think about the energy flowing out through the spaces between the fingers, or else flowing out through your eyes if there's an excess energy in your head. You can simply hold these perceptions in mind, without pushing anything physically, and that will allow the excess energy to release. Or you can think of the body being like a big colander. You've got little holes in the pores of the body through which the excess energy can flow out. Or your body is like a sponge. The energy can flow out in any direction, there's nothing to hold it in. Usually, the problem with excessive rapture is that you start identifying the breath with the flow of the blood in the body, and the flow of the blood begins to push against the walls of the blood vessels. That leads to a perception of pressure or containment. You want to hold in mind the perception of permeability through which that energy can flow out. Another way of calming mental fabrications has to do with perceptions of the breathing process as a whole. When you begin meditating, there's a sense that the breath is coming into the body from outside. After a while, though, you develop a sensitivity to how the breath energy actually originates inside the body. The only thing coming from outside is the air. This is in line with the Buddha's way of analyzing the breath. He doesn't say that it's a tactile sensation felt at the skin. Instead, it's part of the wind property in the body itself. The flow of energy in the body is felt from within. So look into the body to see where the breath seems to originate. Ajahn Lee talks about resting spots of the breath: the tip of the nose, the middle of the head, the base of the throat, the tip of the breastbone, above the navel, but there are other possible spots as well. Focus attention on wherever the breath seems to originate, and think of breath energy radiating effortlessly from that spot. If there are any feelings of tension that seem to get in the way of that radiating energy, think of them dissolving away. An even subtler perception is one where you think of every cell in the body breathing, and all the cells are breathing together. No one spot takes precedence. Your attention is evenly distributed throughout the whole body. It's like a photograph of the Alps taken in the pre-dawn hours when the light is diffuse and every detail has equal importance. This perception can have an extremely calming effect both on the breath and on the mind. At the same time, it helps you not feel threatened or fearful if the breath stops, because you sense full breath energy in every part of the body. You're not starving yourself of breath energy at all. In fact, the opposite. The breath energy feels satisfying and still. These are some of the issues that come up when you're dealing with rapture and pleasure, and then trying to calm the effect that these feelings, along with the perceptions that go with them, have on the mind. You calm the mind down, 1, by the way you breathe, 2, by the perceptions you're holding in mind, and you ultimately get to a feeling of equanimity, the calmest type of feeling, which will have a very calming effect on the mind. You can get the mind into very deep states of concentration this way, by using perceptions that are more and more calming. The overall process is similar to the first tetrad. As I said yesterday, when you calm bodily fabrication to the point where the in and out breath seems to stop, it can take you all the way to the fourth jhana. In this tetrad, when you calm mental fabrication, you can develop states of concentration that take you all the way through the formless jhanas, where there are very refined feelings of equanimity and perceptions so subtle that it's hard to say whether they're perceptions or not. In the very highest level of concentration, the texts say that perceptions and feelings can actually cease. The two tetrads help each other along in this way. So that's the second tetrad. Here, as with the first tetrad, you'll notice the emphasis on the role of the mind in the components of mental fabrication. In the case of perceptions, this is obvious. Perceptions are products of the mind. But this is also true in the case of feelings. The Buddha says elsewhere that the pleasant feelings engendered in concentration come from careful attention, which is an act of the mind. And, of course, we're fostering feelings not of the flesh, the feelings that result from concentration, which can occur only when you intend to give rise to them. It's in this way that even though the first two tetrads focus explicitly on body and feelings, their real purpose is to call attention to the role of the mind in shaping your sense of the body and your feelings, through the way you talk to yourself about the breath, intentionally change the breath, and create feelings of pleasure by the careful way you pay attention to the breath. As you gain more sensitivity in this area, you come to see that the Buddha's basic principle in the first lines of the Dhammapada is right. All phenomena really do have the heart and mind as their forerunner. This is the beginning of real insight into how the mind contains the causes of suffering, but also the potentials for bringing suffering to an end. Question: if I correctly understood your teaching this morning, the breath should be a pleasant flow, with no holding or pressing, etc. In yoga practice, there is kapalbhati breathing and alternate nostril breathing, where we hold the breath for 16, 20, or even more counts, which is not always pleasant. How is this breathing technique related to meditative breathing? Answer: The technique we're teaching here is basically designed to get the mind energized through the processes of bodily and mental fabrication and then get it to calm down with a sense of ease. In other words, the main emphasis is on the effect on the mind. We do it as a means for giving rise to insight and tranquility together. As for the yoga technique, that's mainly for the sake of bodily health. But you can also use the Ajahn Lee technique for bodily health as well. He himself discovered this technique after he had had a heart attack deep in the forest, and he was able to recover from the heart attack and walk many miles out of the forest after practicing it. I myself use this technique to counteract the pains of malaria and to overcome my migraines. I used to have migraines very frequently, and I found that if I breathed in as much as I could, expanding the stomach as far as I could, it was uncomfortable, but it got me out of an unhealthy breathing cycle. So it is okay to use this technique for health purposes too. Question: nothing in existence seems to escape from dependent co-arising. However, only memory seems to escape it. Why is that? Answer: actually, memory is made up of perceptions, sana, and fabrications, sankhara, both of which are parts of dependent co-arising. They come under the factor of fabrication and under the factor of name and form. Question: if I understood this correctly, intention exists before the craving for sensuality, for becoming, or for non-becoming, and then it brings forth clinging and becoming. The question is, what is it that causes this process to get into existence? If the intention exists before the contact at the sense object, what is it that causes the intention to come? Is it the past experience? Is it the memory? Answer: the things that influence the present moment can come from past influences, such as past experiences and memory, but because the mind has the ability to observe itself, sometimes what sets things in motion is a decision made right in the present moment. It's because we have this freedom to act in the present moment that the path of practice to the end of suffering actually makes sense. The Buddha doesn't explain why we have this freedom, but he says that because we have it, we should learn how to take advantage of it. There's a passage where he says that the Dhamma is nourished by commitment and reflection. The Dhamma grows within you because of these two things. And the training and practice is a matter of learning how to develop that quality of reflection so that you can be more observant and take more advantage of the freedom that your powers of observation make available to you. Question: what is the difference between sankharas and kilesas or defilements? Is it that they are the patterns of functioning that are put into action in a repetitive manner in our life? Does meditation permit us to be aware of this or to realize this? Does it let us be liberated from it? Answer: actually, kilesas are a kind of sankhara. Sankhara, remember, is fabrication, which can be good or bad. Sometimes it's repetitive, sometimes not. Kilesas are basically negative sankharas. What we do in meditation is that we learn to use good sankharas to put an end to bad sankharas. After all, the path itself is a kind of sankhara. Virtue is a fabrication. Concentration, discernment, these are all fabrications. We use them to overcome negative fabrications, and then, when they've done their work, we let go of them, too. Here again, I think it's useful to think of the image of the raft that you hold on to swim across the river, and then, when you've arrived, you let it go. 2 questions. First question. Something has always seemed paradoxical to me for a long time in the Buddhist teachings. He teaches us to aim for leaving the cycle of existence, which means to have a desire for non-existence, but nevertheless, he denounces this desire for non-existence in other places. Isn't wanting to get out of the cycle a desire for non-existence? Answer: there is a distinction between the desire for non-existence, or rather, non-becoming, and the desire for no further becoming. The desire for non-becoming basically is the desire to see this current becoming destroyed. The desire for no further becoming is the desire not to start up any new becomings after this one. This is why the Buddhist technique is to allow this current becoming to continue until it runs out on its own, while at the same time you have to be careful not to create the conditions for any new becomings. Notice, I use the word becoming rather than existence for the word bhava. It's wrong to describe the goal as one of non-existence, because the state of the arahant after death cannot be described as existing, not existing, both, or neither. Because people are defined by their desires, and because an arhat has no desires, the arhat cannot be defined and, for that reason, can't be described in any way. In the canon, they illustrate this point with the image of the ocean. The arhat is indescribable in the same way that the water in the ocean is immeasurable. Second question. Wouldn't it be more generous to return as a bodhisattva in existence to aid others to liberate themselves as the Mahayana teaches? Answer. When you're liberating other beings, what are you trying to teach them to do? Aren't you teaching them to leave the process of creating suffering? We all suffer because of our lack of skill. Now, we cannot make anyone else skillful. We can show them how to become more skillful, but each person has to develop the proper skills for him or herself. And one of the best ways of showing people how to do this is to do it by example. Learn how to develop the skills yourself. Here it's important to understand the word, samsara. We usually think of samsara as a place in which beings die and are reborn. Actually, it's an activity. The word literally means wandering on. It's something we do. We create a state of becoming, enter into it, and then, as it falls apart, we wander on and create another. The Buddha teaches that this activity is a bad habit. You could say that it's like smoking or drinking. He was able to kick the habit, and he's showing the rest of us how to kick it too. To say that it would be more compassionate to keep on wandering on to aid others, rather than to stop wandering on, is like saying that it would be more compassionate to keep on smoking and drinking while you teach others to stop smoking and drinking. I must admit my image of the Mahayana view, that you shouldn't leave samsara until everyone else has left, is this: there's a fire in a movie theater, and everyone is rushing for the door. Bodhisattvas are clustered at the door, and one says, "You first," and each of the others say, "No, you first." The result is that everyone is going to get burned to death. Question. What relationship exists between the karma of parents and those who are their children? Is it an illusion to want to repair or ameliorate the unskillful behavior of our parents? And do our children carry with them part of our own karma in them? Answer. The fact that you were born to your parents means that you have some kind of karma in common. Either you did this karma together, or you did it separately in separate places, but it's still similar karma. That's why we have the phrase in the chant, karma bandhu. We're related through our karma, but each of us has our own individual karma. Your parents do not infect you with their karma, and your children don't carry on part of your own karma. However, if you're the child and you want to improve your parents' karma, it is possible. You set a good example. But you know how difficult it is for children to teach their parents, so you have to be very diplomatic. The best way to teach is through example. Question. Can you form the hope to be welcomed at the moment of death, the grand passage, with people you've loved or the people for whom you may have some devotion or teachers who have put us on the path of the Dhamma? I have lots of gratitude for these persons. Answer. There's no need to put the word person or people in quotation marks. There is the belief sometimes that the Buddha teaches that there are no persons, but actually he teaches that there are persons as long as there's the process of becoming. We keep on taking on the identity of people, of persons, through our attachments and clingings as we go from life to life to life. It's only when you reach Nibbana that you go beyond being a person. Now, the question concerns the hope for being welcomed by the people you love or to whom you're devoted. You have to be careful, because sometimes the people you have loved are not in really good destinations. They may have gone to a lower destination. If you tell yourself, I want to be with them, that aspiration might pull you down to their lower level. Second, the fact that you loved each other in this lifetime doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to love each other in the next lifetime. In Thailand, I knew of a monk and a nun who were meditating one time, and each saw that they had been married in a previous lifetime. So they disrobed and picked up where they'd left off. Apparently in the previous lifetime, they had loved each other very much, but in this lifetime they separated 8 times and had 8 children. When I met the woman, she looked pretty miserable. This is why the Buddha says not to focus on people. Focus instead on the good actions you've done. He says that your good actions will actually be like relatives welcoming you to the new life. Question. At the moment of death, is it possible that there will be beings who will come to look for you or to accompany you to the next life? Is this going to be good or bad? Answer. Well, it depends on the beings. There are stories of devas coming to help you go up to the deva world. There are stories of hell wardens coming to take you down to the lower realms. There are also stories of people who don't have anyone to guide them at all. Either they go to a new life of their own accord, or they get lost and wander around aimlessly for a while. So, it's best to depend on yourself. But if you see hell wardens come for you, that's when you should bring to mind all the good actions you've done in this lifetime. Your acts of generosity, virtue, and meditation. That's your protection from hell wardens. Question: even though there are not necessarily treatments or doctors against aging, from the point of view of the practice, is there a particular difference between aging and an incurable disease, such as a degenerative disease? Answer: from the point of view of the practice, you treat them the same. You realize that because of the weakening of the body, you need to strengthen your mind, which is going to be the topic of tonight's talk. Question: because morphine is considered to be an intoxicant in the case of a human being, such as a dying relative or an animal who is suffering the pains of death, is it appropriate to give morphine to them, or would it be contrary to the fifth precept? Answer: no, it's not contrary to the precept. The fifth precept is against the use of intoxicants such as alcohol, but there is an exception. For the monks, the use of alcohol is allowed when it's part of a medicine. Based on that principle, morphine and other similar drugs are considered to be allowable as painkillers. However, you want to be as alert as possible at the moment of death. If you're the patient, ask the doctor to give only the amount that's really needed to take the edge off the pain, and not so much as to make you confused. The amount will depend on how much pain there is and how much pain the person can stand. They found in America that if you allow the patient to control the amount of morphine that he or she gets through a morphine drip, the patient will tend to take less. Often in hospitals, the nurses are overworked. They won't have time to come back and give you another shot for the next 24 hours, so they tend to overdose you to carry you through the whole day. As for animals, I would give them a little morphine. They don't need to be all that sharp, and you can't ask them, is this enough morphine or is it too much? Question: a close friend of mine is in palliative care, aware that morphine will make her less and less present. She meditates, but none of her close family does. What can she do for herself, besides remembering all of her good actions rather than the not good ones? What else? What can I do while I'm here on retreat? What happens to the mind when the body is under powerful sedation, which is going to be the case because of the pain? Answer: the best things she can do for herself are, 1. to think of her good actions in the past, and 2. to learn how to relate to her pain in the present in such a way that she can see that the pain and her awareness of the pain are two different things. This is a point that we explained in previous retreats, and we're going to be talking about it again tomorrow night. If you want to read a book to her while she's in palliative care, read the relevant passages from Good Heart, Good Mind, and the 5 Faculties, which are available in French translation. What you can do while you're here on retreat is that you can spread lots of goodwill in her direction. When the body is under sedation, the mind tends to be in a suppressed state. It's as if it's in a fog, so it's difficult to make clear decisions. The power of your goodwill might help to lift some of the fog. There's always the question of what exactly happens at the moment of death to people under sedation. Sometimes they suddenly wake up and come to their senses when they realize they're dying, sometimes they don't. And that moment of death, even though for us it looks like a very short moment, for the person who's experiencing that moment, it can be quite long, and choices can be made in that moment. I was almost electrocuted to death one time. For me, it felt like 5 minutes, but for the people who saw it happening, it was just like a finger snap. It seems long because your mind's spinning very fast. So, if you're with a person who's passing away, even if they seem to be sedated or in a coma, it's good to read passages of Dhamma to them or to talk to them about the good things they've done. Things like that may help to penetrate the fog. Question: how to deal with the death of a loved one, your loved companion, your dearest grandmother, your cat, the best cat ever. How to deal with loneliness, emptiness, absence, lack of contact, no exchange, just silence. I'm afraid of that. Answer: this is a topic that we'll be covering later on in the week, but the first thing to realize is that death is not the end of your contact with that being. Because of your karma in common, You will most likely meet each other again unless either of you attains nibbana first, so it's not totally the end. Second, the worst part of the silence is the sense of being powerless to help the other person, but as the Buddha explains, you can make merit and dedicate it to the person who's passed away. You can do this with animals too. From the Buddha's point of analysis, when you leave someone or someone has left you like this, it's almost as if a part of your identity, your sense of what I am, has been ripped out, so it's going to take a while for that wound to heal. So whatever expression you want to give to your grief, go ahead and express it until you realize that it's becoming self-indulgent. Then bring to mind the fact that this happens to everybody. Look around. Everybody's lost somebody. When you reflect on this, it can turn your grief into compassion for all the suffering that goes on in samsara, which is a much more skillful emotion than grief. We'll talk more about this later in the week. Can I tell one funny story before we go? One time, when I was at the monastery in Thailand and Ajahn Phuong was away, one of the local neighbors came in and said he wanted 2 monks to come to his house to chant a funeral chant. So I asked him, "Who died?" He smiled. I said, "If somebody has died, how can you smile?" And he said, "You'll see." So 2 of us went to the house. They had planted vegetables the Chinese way and raised beds with little walls, with each bed full of vegetables. And in several of the raised beds, all the vegetables had died. The wife was convinced it was foul play, so she wanted 2 monks to chant the funeral service for the vegetables. Then, when the monks gave the blessing, you may have seen Thai people do this sometimes, they'll pour water into a little bowl to dedicate the merit to the deceased, and then they pour the water in the bowl under a tree. But this time, the wife was going to put hot peppers and salt in the water, and she was going to put a curse on whoever killed the vegetables. So we said, "Wait a minute. What if your husband used a tank for pesticide and then put fertilizer in the tank without washing out the pesticide? Do you want to put a curse on your husband?" My favorite part of the story was that she stopped for a moment before she said, "No." But then the neighbors who had come to watch said to us, "Well, as long as you're here, go ahead, do the chant anyhow." So we did it. I think the other monk and I are probably the only monks who ever did a funeral service for vegetables.